Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Grand Rounds. Before we get started, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. For those of you that are in person, we have a sign-in sheet in the back. So if you're interested in receiving CE credit, please be sure to sign in, and then I will send instructions on how to claim CE credit after the session. For those of you that are online, there was a registration link that asked for your email address prior to attending the session. So I will be sure to send you instructions on how to claim CE credit after the session. We are going to have a 10-minute Q&A session after the presentation. So if you have any questions, please be sure to post those in the chat. But today we have Dr. Amir Ali presenting on the cost of cancer drugs and unreliable FDA drug approvals. Dr. Ali is a board-certified hematology oncology clinical pharmacist and strives to challenge the status quo and push oncology practice forward through community outreach, teaching, clinical research, and clinical practice. Dr. Ali is a UCSF and PGY2 residency trained with over 5 years practice experience in major hospital systems. Background involves pharmacy and therapeutics committees, IRB research, and adjunct assistant professor of the University of Southern California. He has extensive presentation experience spanning conferences, grand rounds, clinics. He's also an Aspen and HOBA grant recipient and author of 5 major publications. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our speaker.
All right. Hello, everyone. It's a little bit of an older bio, so I'll have to but I want to thank you all for joining us today. And those of you online, we have 55 people online. So it's great to see that you're able to join us today. So thank you very much, Lisa, for the introduction. For those of you joining us online, if you cannot hear me, please comment in the chat and I'll certainly speak up or we'll figure it out. So we have a nice mixture. I was looking at the participants today. I saw that we have at least 6 physicians joining. We have some nurses, certainly a lot of pharmacists here as well, pharmacy students, those of you that have taken my course in the past. Really, my hope for today is to have more of a discussion rather than just going through lecture slides, talking about some of these costs, the burdens that not only health systems face, but patients face as well. And I completely understand not all of you here are experts in oncology that are joining us today. But really what we've noticed is that the cost of drugs, new FDA approvals, costs are going up regardless of disease state. So really this is relevant to all major disease states out there, and we need to certainly keep these things in mind. The other thing I want to point out is, one of the reasons why I want to give this talk. Why is this a passion of mine? And it really started off, Lisa shared, I completed my residency at Kaiser Permanente. And I remember one of the first patients I've ever counseled on a medication. So I sat there counseling the patient on the medication. I was very excited. It's about a new cancer drug. I was making sure I hit every single point, making sure that I don't miss anything. And then towards the end of the conversation with the patient, one thing stood out. He said, I'm actually not able to afford this right now. I haven't been taking it. And he was explaining to me that he was paying around $5,000 a month for the treatment. And he was trying to decide between paying for rent, paying for the medication, and this month he was not able to afford either one. So that, it really caught my attention, and I had to step back a little bit and reassess, is this something that I'm actually asking patients for in terms of if they're able to access the medication? We can prescribe, recommend all the different treatment options out there, but if the patient's not able actually to afford it, able to take the medication, what's the purpose? And so really you'll see the objectives on the next few slides, but this presentation is not meant to vilify the pharmaceutical industry in any way. They do some amazing work. We wouldn't have any treatment options without them, but it's rather to have a conversation about the costs and ways that we can address some of these rising costs that we're going to be seeing. And so, again, if you have any comments, any questions that come up throughout the presentation, I'll try to monitor the chat for those of you joining in person. Feel free to interrupt me at any time. All right, so here's just some disclosures, no conflicts of interest. And second bullet point's important as well. So opinions are my own and do not represent the views of the USC Mann School of Pharmacy. So here are the objectives for today. We're going to start off by really talking about the costs of cancer care, and then we're going to dive into some of the FDA approvals, some flaws that we can see in FDA approvals. Again, same concept, certainly the FDA does amazing work, right? But there are some flaws that have been noticed in regards to some of the FDA approvals out there. And we'll be discussing some of these things. And a lot of these things have been in conversations in the past in different ODAC committees with the FDA. And so we're going to shed some light on some of those points and how we can move forward in the future. So I always like to start off with this slide. And it's about the cost of cancer treatment. And this is pretty much per dose. I have them kind of blocked out for now because I want to kind of hear some of your estimates. I completely understand that the pharmacists in this room, they don't get to share prices because they know the prices very well. But for those of you that are students, maybe less familiar with the prices, those of you joining on the chat, you can put it in the chat. What do you think the price of cisplatin is, for example, which is a kind of an old school chemotherapy used for bladder cancer, price per dose? Anyone in this room have thoughts? And I'll open up the chat as well. So 5,000. Woman says too much. Okay, so we'll give you that answer soon. What about some oral drugs? And I'm talking about per pill for dasatinib and zanubrutinib. Okay.
50 cents.
50 cents, 500, that's definitely a big difference. Some of our new bispecifics, teclistamab, epcoritamab. So $20 per pill, $200 per pill. Yeah, that's very accurate from Human, 17K a month.
Yeah.
Jennifer Cannon, 300, 500 per pill. And then on the right-hand side, we have some of our other treatment options. So we have Rituxan, brand name Rituxan, a CD20 monoclonal antibody used to treat a lot of malignancies and non-malignancies as well, used in rheumatology, multiple sclerosis. What do you guys think per dose? Right under that is Truxima, which is considered a biosimilar. How much do you think that price drops in terms of average wholesale price? So I'm not talking about contracted pricing. I'm talking about, wholesale price from the manufacturer.
30% drop from reference.
30% drop from the reference product, okay? What do you think? Then we have the CAR Ts. CAR T, how much does a CAR T cost? Yes, Carter, for example. 300,000, 750,000.
1 mil.
1 mil. The last one, okay, Lyfgenia is a gene therapy approved for sickle cell disease.
3 mil.
3 million.
3 million. So some of you already know. So 3 million. So let me show the prices now. Okay, so you can take a look at some of the prices compared to what you guessed. And you can certainly see, price per pill, dasatinib 671, zanubrutinib 579. Rituxan versus Truxima, what is that? Probably like a 10% decrease or so between the brand name and the biosimilar. And then you can also see Yescarta, which is CAR T, cellular therapy to treat different malignancies. 500,000, probably a price of, I used to say house, but maybe a nice 1-bedroom, 1-bath condo, I would say. But Lyfgenia, that would get you a nice house. Bakersfield, maybe over there. So, these are the prices, right? And what we're seeing is that these prices are continuing to rise, right? So we saw in 2015, the annual cost that we were spending on cancer care, $182 billion. And that number is projected to increase to $250 billion by the time we hit 2030. So huge increases, spending $250 billion just solely on cancer care. Who are these people that pay for treatments, right? So you can see it's just a mixture of different payers. Not only do you have private insurers, Medicare, Medicaid, but the patients are also involved in this as well. $5.6 billion in terms of cancer care, for these patients. So you can see the breakdown here, and that leads us to the next point, really, of financial toxicity. So, as pharmacists, our focus is always on, drug toxicity for the patient. That's our focus, right? But an important focus at the same time as we're discussing patients not having access to the treatments for cost reasons is really the financial toxicity component. Not only are you having to pay for the treatment itself, but you're also having to take time off work, skin care, whatever. Gas prices these days is becoming absurd. So these are all certainly important considerations that we have for our patients. This is a figure that essentially shows you the launch prices of these drugs compared to the median household incomes. You can see the blue line is the cost of these treatment options. This is adjusted for inflation. This was looked at until about 2016 or so. And you can see our median household income has really not risen that much in the past decades. I want to point out that 1999 was actually a big year. That was the year that Taxol was approved for cancer care, used in different malignancies. Does anyone know what a blockbuster drug is? Heard of blockbuster drug? So a blockbuster drug is a drug that's able to exceed $1 billion in revenue. Historically, that's thought to be only a drug that's used in chronic disease states. Think Lipitor, for example. But what we've also seen is cancer drugs. Taxol was the first drug that hit the cancer drug that actually got blockbuster status. And in fact, we're getting close to our first $1 trillion drug. Does anyone know? Can anyone guess what our first $1 trillion drug is going to be? It is a cancer drug. Keytruda. So pembrolizumab is projected to hit $1 trillion before the patent expires for the drug. So I actually ran into this article a few days ago, and it really got me thinking. So, we're talking about financial toxicity, and you're seeing the burden, the cost of these treatment options for patients. And this article essentially shows, of course, there could be some complicit bias that is presented in this article, but it's essentially showing medical debt linked to worse health outcomes. So linked to premature deaths from any cause, including cancer, heart disease, suicide, the stress that's resulting from that these patients are experiencing. And what you're also seeing is that these drugs are also increasing in price over time. So it's not just the average wholesale price that is labeled on the drug upon approval, it's increasing each month, far surpassing the rates of inflation. So you can see these are some of the oral chemotherapies that we administer for different patients, and it shows you the vast increases, drugs that are doubling in price over time. And this is just one example. So we specifically look at a drug called imatinib, Gleevec brand name. It's a very commonly used drug, used in various different malignancies. You can see the price at average wholesale price at FDA approval in 2001. $4,000, and you can see, this is looked at again in 2015 and 16, it's hitting around $10,000 for patients. Now you may be wondering, we now have a generic product for Gleevec, and what we're seeing with these high-cost cancer drugs is typically, and this is referenced, each generic entrant on the market has a price reduction about 10% of what the branded medication costs. So you saw that with Rituxan, about a 10% decrease. And you're seeing that now here with Gleevec. Now, there have been changes with Gleevec, and this is the whole Mark Cuban cost plus drugs effect. So the price has gone a bit since this publication came out. But Gleevec is not the only drug that we're seeing similar situations in. And at the same time, you might be wondering, we're certainly, one of the reasons why drugs have to be priced so highly is because it certainly takes a lot of money, a lot of revenue, for R&D purposes, to discover these drugs. So median R&D drugs, typically the cost to get a drug to market is around $650 million on average. And on the right-hand side, you kind of see the comparison of R&D compared to the revenue since the product's approval. You can certainly see enzalutamide, different examples on the slides, ibrutinib, that the stark difference between R&D costs and the revenue generated I will even note that the ones that are, the smaller revenue differences, those are, when this was analyzed in 2017, those products were just approved. So they haven't gone through their whole life cycle. So you can see certainly the stark difference between them. And we can also take a look and see the difference between R&D costs for the companies and the amount of money that they're spending on marketing, right? So you can see the breakdown on this slide. You can see certain companies that are spending double the amount on sales and marketing of the product compared to the actual costs that they spend on R&D. Surely, if we're paying this much for cancer treatments, hundreds of thousands of dollars, the outcomes must be great, right? We must have cures, we must have, quality of life improvements, overall survival for these patients might be going up. But this was an amazing publication that I read that really shows you that there is no relationship, no significant relationship between the costs that we're paying and improvements in these patients, improvements in overall survival for these patients, improvements in progression-free survival for these patients. So it really gets you to think, we're paying these high costs for treatment options, but we're not really seeing the results that we're looking for. Okay. So how are these costs of cancer drugs justified? Certainly, there's a lot of different thoughts on this, approaches to take on this, but so far what we've noticed is that the cost of cancer drugs is not explained by the novelty of the product, the cost of R&D. We're not seeing a correlation between improvements of endpoints for these treatment options. What we're really seeing is a lot of this justification and these reports that are cited is really utilization projections that different manufacturers have and tolerability in the US marketplace. One of the things that I always look at when I look at a cost of a treatment option is the value. And we're trying to look at how do we better define value for these costs. Different committees, ICER, we'll talk about briefly, the Institute of Clinical and Economic Review, likes to look at value when they make these decisions on the costs of medications and what to add to a company's formulary. So here's a kind of a basic definition of value. You look at the benefits, and the way we define benefits is by looking at something called the quality adjusted life year. And this is used in a lot of different malignancies, other disease states, and it's essentially a price tag on how much as a society we are willing to pay to give a patient 1 year of good life, right? And for the most part, as our society, we have decided that that threshold should be somewhere between 100,000 to 150,000. So the balance, how we come up with these numbers, is you look at a number that's able to reward innovation, reward a company coming out with the new treatment options, but also take into account that not every health system, not every insurer has infinite resources, right? At a certain point, the scale tips over that we're paying too much money and we're cutting down on other services for these patients. So certainly it's a balance over there. So you're looking at quality adjusted life years, and you're dividing that number by the costs and toxicities that patients are going through. And so you see the median quality adjusted life year in a lot of these medications about $250,000, so exceeding that adjustment. So I do have an example. So we will break this down and we'll start off with some hematology examples. That's currently my focus, is mostly hematology and transplantation. So here's an example of CAR-T. And for those of you maybe on the call that are not familiar with CAR-T, essentially it's a process where we harness the body's own immune system to fight the cancer. So you take the patient's white blood cells and you give it a target specifically targeting the cancer. And what we notice, you can see a kind of a breakdown here in terms of real world costs. We talked about the product itself in terms of the average wholesale price, about $500,000. And we said maybe you can buy a house in Bakersfield with that amount. But at the same time, there's other costs associated with it. You're admitting patients. You're providing other treatment options. These patients may be ending up in the ICU. You're giving other drugs at the same time. So real-world costs of CAR-T about $700 to $1 million. And so I want to look at a drug specifically, a specific CAR T drug. And this drug is called ide-cel. We currently do not have this as a treatment option at USC. And we look at the treatment. So it's indicated for the treatment of multiple myeloma. So for some background here, multiple myeloma is a cancer that you cannot cure. It's a non-curative cancer. What you do with multiple myeloma is you give a treatment option, you try to prolong the time until the patient relapses. So you're just giving some buffer room for the patient. What the clinical trial saw was the median duration of response, meaning how long a patient can stay on therapy, was 11 months, right? So you give the patient CAR T, you're admitting them for a month long, costs $700,000, $1 million, and you're giving a patient about 11 months time until they potentially relapse. And we can see in the real world setting, these numbers will change. And we'll talk about in the second half of this lecture is that the results in trials are not always what we see in the real world setting. So this number could be less. And certainly there are many institutions that are reporting real world data that is less than 11 months, 6 months even, right? And you're putting a patient through a treatment option that you're in the hospital for a month. You could actually pass away from the CAR T. You can end up in the ICU. You can have long-term effects of the therapy. So this is actually an ICER report that I kind of previously showed with you that's specifically looking at CAR T. And, we talked about these thresholds, the willingness to pay. These are kind of benchmark thresholds, 100,000, 150,000. And this shows you, WAC pricing for the different therapy options out there, right? And actually, these numbers have changed quite a bit since this report came out in 2021. It's upwards of over $500,000 at this point for these CAR T therapies. And it's essentially showing you the discount that's needed off the WAC to hit these thresholds that ICER defines and us as a society think is feasible for payment. So we have a checkpoint. So because this is a CE, we have to have some checkpoint questions on there. And for those of you in the listening in from the chat, what do you guys think? So the question is, according to the study discussed in the presentation, which of the following factors explains the high costs of cancer drugs? A, drug novelty, B, costs of cancer research and development, C, improvements in endpoints, D, none of the above. Right, so Daisy got the Keytruda one. Lisa, do you want? So D. So Human says D, the correct answer. Lisa, I don't know, the screen just
It froze.
changed over here.
You need to just put it in presentation mode. Nope.
The desktop has showing something else than what the projector is showing.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I feel like
I know, we're getting hacked. a
I
little.
feel like we got hacked last time.
Really?
Yeah. Our last round.
If I can control it, well, maybe I can control it from the screen.
Just go down.
Yeah,
Okay, get rid of the chat.
let's do that. The desktop is showing some other screen now. All right, here's the next question. So the financial burden associated with cancer treatment is referred to as financial toxicity and can lead to which of the following outcomes? Improvement of quality of life, increase in overall survival, increased median medication non-adherence rates, or enhanced access to therapy. Any thoughts in the room? That's right. So here's the next portion, and we're wrapping up here. So the next portion is really talking about some of the flaws that we've seen in recent FDA approvals. And again, I do want to emphasize the point, and I think, have some preceptors from the FDA joining us in the call today. Certainly the FDA does a lot of work. In fact, with one of our own physicians from USC, Dr. Nieva, is actually on the ODAC committee, recently voted on some of these questions that come up from the FDA. Just here to kind of share some ideas, share some insight, and see how we can strategically work together to solve some of these issues. So previously, we talked about the value proposition. And what we see is that value proposition can get even worse when you're looking at the differences between patients included in clinical trials compared to patients actually in the real world setting. Patients in clinical trials, depending on the inclusion criteria, are often healthier. They have better renal function, they have better performance status, they have less transfusions, they're younger patients compared to patients that were, it's those hard to treat patients that we often see in clinic. And so here's a proportion of these patients that are included in the trial depending on age. And so I do want to share one example of this, right? So I'm shifting gears a little bit towards oncology, so solid tumor malignancies. So this is a study. Has anyone heard of the SHARP trial? So it's actually looking at sorafenib for the treatment of hepatocellular carcinoma, so HCC. So the trial, from the pivotal trial, the clinical trial that led to the approval, is on the left-hand side. So they look at sorafenib and they compare it to placebo for liver cancer. And you can see that, this is a Kaplan-Meier curve, and how you interpret that is you essentially basically look at the kind of the distances between the two lines. And if the distances is greater, that means the drug is working better in comparison to placebo. And so sometimes we joke when we're reviewing a trial, like typically all you need to get through is to be able to fit a laser point in between the curves and you're good. But here that led to the approval. So there is sorafenib over there in clinical trials. And so what was done years later is actually look at real world outcomes for these patients. These are Medi-Cal, Medicare patients that are propensity matched to each other. So these are patients in red that receive no treatment, otherwise placebo. And in green and in blue, these are patients that receive sorafenib. So in the real world outcomes trial, they actually found no difference in overall survival. So these are much more patients that were included in here than the clinical trial. They found no difference in overall survival for these patients. In fact, and this is really important, the placebo group of the clinical trial did better than the treatment group in the real world setting. Does that make sense? The placebo group in the clinical trial did better than the treatment group in the real world setting. So I think that just gives us an understanding of how we need to approach these clinical trials, the diversity that we need to have in these clinical trials, the inclusion criteria that we need to have. So certainly big differences over there. Another example I have is the POLO trial. I don't know if anyone's heard of the POLO trial here, but this came out a few years back. And essentially this trial looked at maintenance olaparib for germline BRCA-mutated metastatic pancreatic cancer. We know that these patients with BRCA mutations, right, it can affect different patients. You have an 80% risk of developing breast cancer, prostate cancer, and pancreatic cancer as well with the BRCA mutation. And typically these are younger people, right? Patients in their 30s, 40s. If they have the BRCA mutation, they develop these bad malignancies. And so this was a trial looking at maintenance olaparib for these BRCA mutated prostate cancer patients. Who did they include in this trial? These are patients with measurable pancreatic cancer who had BRCA mutation. And essentially what you do with pancreatic cancer that's metastasized, you give a FOLFOX regimen. You give a fluorouracil 5-FU regimen. For those of you who've had the oncology course before, you've seen this. That is the main treatment for these patients. And it's shown that this chemotherapy kind of concoction works for these patients. So that is the standard of care. And you keep these patients on this therapy. If they're responding to it, you keep them on that therapy, this chemotherapy, as long as you can. Because we know, once they stop that therapy, you don't really have any other options besides that, nothing that's been proven. So what they looked at, they included patients that did not have evidence or progression after about 4 months of platinum-based first-line therapy. So this platinum chemotherapy is really the standard of care that we should give for these patients. What they did was they say, okay, well, you're responding, you're doing well on this platinum chemotherapy. We're actually going to take you off of that and put you on this study. And we're either going to give you a sugar pill or a pill that we don't know if it works yet. So that's the study, olaparib, or we put you on placebo. You're taking these young patients that should probably, or most definitely stay on therapy. You're removing them if they're responding, no evidence of progression, and you're randomizing them to sugar pill or olaparib. So again, whenever IRBs are trained to look at this what's the standard of practice for these patients? And the standard of practice is to continue platinum treatments if the patient is responding, right? So you should continue it as long as possible. And so one of the points that I hone in on with students in any practice setting is that, whenever you're reviewing a clinical trial or you're making a recommendation for a patient based on a study that you read, right? We're all, pharmacists, physicians, APPs here. We look at a clinical trial, we make a recommendation on it. It's important that we just don't look at the conclusion. We have to look at the study design, what it was compared to. And if you see that a control arm is worse than what the patient would have been receiving anyway, it's probably not a good trial design. So I take this BRCA mutated patient. Would I just give them a sugar pill if they're not responding? Probably not. So why would I want to recommend a patient be on this therapy? So a clinical trial should only change your practice if the control arm is your practice, right? So these are some, take-home points. And so what were the results of this trial? And so starting off with the response rate. So they saw kind of about a 10% response rate between olaparib and the placebo. Why do you guys think the placebo arm had a 10% response rate? Any thoughts why? And you guys can share in the chat as well. Any thoughts why there's a 10% response rate to placebo?
Kind of carrying probably.
Exactly. So residual efficacy from the chemotherapy is giving this response rate for the placebo. And what else did they see in this clinical trial? This study showed some progression-free survival benefit, which essentially is saying that the tumor is not worsening, but they found no benefit in overall survival. So how long that the patient lives for, and most importantly, in my opinion, no quality of life benefit for these metastatic pancreatic patients. So it's an important determination. And so this was looked at from the FDA perspective, and it was approved. $12,000 a month for this pill as maintenance. That does not yield quality of life benefit, does not yield overall survival benefit. And one of the questions I have, and maybe some of you have this thought as well, what would the result of this trial be if they actually went head-to-head against the chemotherapy? So if you compare olaparib to the platinum therapy, what would happen? I think they would have shown non-inferior or inferior, actually. I don't think they would have gotten approval in that case. So these study designs are so incredibly important to really examine. So I have another knowledge checkpoint. Which of the following statements is true regarding the Polo trial? You can drop your thoughts in the chat as well. So I do have one more example for you. What we have here is for prostate cancer. Now, prostate cancer is one of the most common malignancies in males. Certainly, many individuals are affected by this. And what we see here is a drug called sipuleucel T, which is also known as brand name Provenge, that was studied for castration-resistant prostate cancer. So it was looking at the study drug, sipuleucel T, versus placebo for these patients. And the trial design for the study was, in my opinion, very problematic. So typically, the way that this study was designed is there is two groups. There's a placebo group, first bullet point, And the second bullet point is the cilta-cel T group, so the study drug. So the way they designed this crossover study is that a patient in the placebo group, let's say they progress, obviously the placebo is not probably going to work. If they progress, they're allowed to switch to the study drug. But if they're in the treatment group, the cilta-cel T, and they progress, they get switched to docetaxel, which docetaxel is actually FDA approved for prostate cancer. There's evidence for using it. It's a chemotherapy that we use very often for prostate cancer. So the efficacy is established there. So you can probably tell that the treatment arms are not really balanced that well. So you can tell that one treatment arm has a study drug and a chemotherapy that works, and you're comparing it to a placebo and a study drug that you don't know if it's working. So the results, I can tell you the results even before they conducted the trial, what it's going to show, right? So you can see 72% of these patients crossed over. Is this actually a true overall survival benefit that was seen, or was this just likely the intervention arm was better because they had life-saving chemotherapy on there, right? And so this study was a pivotal trial, was FDA approved, $93,000, 3 infusions over 6 weeks. So, I talked a lot about doom and gloom here, but, there are certainly important reasons why we're conducting these trials, but we also have to be vigilant of the types of trials that we onboard. Every institution needs to be cautious of these things. IRBs have to be vigilant for these. Pharmacists can be huge in terms of looking out for these types of trials and making these points known. So, a lot of these treatment options that I've shared with you today are products that have gone through something called accelerated approval. Accelerated approval is something that the FDA defines as an urgent treatment for an unmet need that should be available to the patients as soon as possible. So many drugs are approved for different malignancies through the accelerated approval route. And typically what happens is they'll conduct a phase 1b/2 study, and they'll get accelerated approval. And there's something called confirmatory trials to keep the drug approved, right, to get full approval. And so this was a recent study that I read a few weeks ago from AACR. It's an abstract that looked at 46 drugs with at least 5 years of follow-up, right? 46 drugs that received accelerated approval. They saw that 63% of them were converted to full regular approval. 22% of them were withdrawn because they failed their confirmatory trial. And 15% of them were remaining as accelerated approval for about 6.3 years later. So that's a long time for us to say, you know what, we're giving you accelerated approval without having the full data. We don't exactly know if this benefits patients. 6 years is a long time for these patients. So, what's the purpose of a confirmatory trial if the drug is left out for a long time, or we don't actually revoke drugs that don't show benefits to patients? And these are just some of the headlines that we've seen in recent years. So you can see some of these are myeloma drugs that have been withdrawn from the market actually after failing confirmatory trials. So some trials that show numerically inferior survival compared to the alternative options, right, do not show progression-free survival benefits for these patients. It's odd. You see, you're giving a drug and actually patients do worse on it, and it was on the market for a long time. But it's important that we caught these things, right? That's why we need to push for confirmatory trials to read out as soon as possible. These are some of the other drugs. Just a small snippet. There's pages and pages of other drugs that have been withdrawn that were given accelerated approval. So certainly something to be vigilant about. So what can be done? So that's the $1 million question there. What can be done? What can we do to be better advocates for our patients, to be better advocates as health systems? So ASCO is a oncology organization, and one thing that we're working on with them is defining standards of care, right? So you look at a treatment option, and I'll show you, hey, statistically, these patients did better. But there's certainly a difference between statistical significance and clinical significance for patients, right? So if I show a patient, hey, this drug increased progression-free survival by 2 months. You're gonna pay about 10 grand a month for this. What does that mean to a patient, right? Am I gonna live longer? We don't know that. That hasn't been proven, right? So actually defining clinical significance and comparing that statistical significance is truly important for these patients. What we can work on with the FDA is looking at these endpoints as well, focusing on endpoints that actually prolong life rather than just our surrogate endpoints, right? Looking at quality of life benefits for these patients. That's incredibly important to see, are patients' quality of life improving? Am I giving a drug to a patient that they can potentially live 2 months longer, but they'll also be given about 50 different side effects at the same time, and probably will be miserable in those 2 months. So it's certainly an important consideration. Enforcing post-marketing studies that may confirm or refute drug benefits, requiring diversity in these clinical trials, and by diversity, I mean, more spectrum of patients with different ages, different comorbidities. So broadening our inclusion criteria. What can CMS do? Incentivize good evidence, potentially having price caps for accelerated approval drugs for manufacturers to encourage them to develop more evidence as fast as they can and utilize value-based payment agreements with these manufacturers. Certainly conversations that can be had and different perspectives on that as well. So our last knowledge checkpoint question as we wrap up here. So which of the following strategies should be implemented to help lower the cost of cancer drugs and yield more reliable clinical trials? So the answer is all of the above. Here are the references, and we can open it up to any questions that you may have. If anyone has any questions on the chat, you can feel free to type it in, or if anyone has a question. Yes.
So, thank you for the presentation. I should have told you who I am before I open my mouth. So I'm Nancy Smirkanich. I'm a professor in the Department of Regulatory and Quality Science, so I look at things through a regulatory lens. I worked in the pharmaceutical industry for almost 40 years before I came to USC, on many of the medications that you actually showed in your graph. And I just want to make sure that people are, I took exception to the use of the word unreliable in your study, in your presentation talk title, because you're associating unreliable with the approval piece and then the financial piece, because it's all in one title. And as you know, FDA does not get involved in the pricing of products at all. Also, the standard for approval for most of those drugs was 2 well-controlled clinical trials, most of which had to be conducted globally. And so when you look at standard of care, I hope everyone has an appreciation for the fact that the drugs available to do standard of care comparison in the US are very different than globally. So you have to pick a standard of care that's accessible in order to do the clinical trials. And so again, the kind of more points of clarification. And then the only other one was about the endpoint. I worked with a company for 10 years that was working on a trial for a monoclonal antibody, a radiolabeled monoclonal antibody for ovarian cancer. And we could not get FDA to budge off of overall survival as the endpoint. 10 years later, they wouldn't look at progression-free survival. Europe would, Japan would, whatever. FDA wouldn't give us the surrogate. And surrogate endpoints are the accelerated approval pathway. And they wouldn't budge off of it. The company went out of business. The drug never made it to the market. I think if we had availability of that to do the trial over again with progression-free survival, we would have seen that the drug actually worked, because it actually did work in about 30% of the women. So I do think that, again, when you're using things like accelerated approval, surrogate endpoints, those things were all put into place so that we could get medications to patients sooner. And so I would guess I would ask, what would your substitution be for overall survival if in fact that delays getting the medications to the market for these patients?
Well, that's a wonderful point. And I'm actually very happy that you're joining us today. It's very important to hear different perspectives here, because certainly I come with one perspective. So it's amazing that we're seeing different perspectives here today. And so one thing I do want to point out is that, you're right, that the surrogate endpoints are typically used for FDA approval. But for example, if we look at the POLO trial for metastatic pancreatic cancer, and you look at what's the limitation, why are we not using overall survival in that study? Overall survival is often a limitation if you think, the time it takes to get results for that trial will be too long, right? Because you're waiting for patients to unfortunately pass away before you can get that median number. And so certain malignancies, that's definitely harder. But for pancreatic cancer, for example, I think that should be the default, right? Focusing on that endpoint because patients are passing away within months. So you're able to get that data piece really quickly compared to other cancers, for example. And also kind of mandating that we look at these things for the confirmatory trials as well. Okay, so if we use a surrogate for the accelerated approval, then we certainly need to make sure that we're looking at these core OS endpoints for the confirmatory trials as well. So yeah, there are different perspectives on this, right? And it's always a balance to make sure that we get patients these therapies as fast as we can compared to also making sure that we're giving the best possible care to patients, that we're giving safe and effective treatment options to them. Yes.
I wonder what are your thoughts from the point of view of the clinical trial design. It seems to me that something that is not problematic is the post-protocol treatment. Like for the PFS, you are, like you initially give the patient like the drug and the experimental drug and the whatever standard of care, quote unquote. But then if this patient like progresses, when you're gonna measure overall survival, like years after, that type of treatment that they receive after progression, it's like very important, right? Because that's what can actually also determine that overall survival. Like if you're not offering really like that best treatment after progression, then you're gonna be sort of like skewed. I think it talk a little bit about like that the POLO trial where you are comparing, was it the POLO or the SHARP? I forgot. But the one where you're comparing like patients that progress and were able to receive a platinum-based therapy versus the other ones that didn't receive anything else. So it seems to me like like that post-progression treatment is like something very, very important to consider.
Absolutely. And to your point, so I sit down with these patients, right? And what they ask me is this, okay, you're giving me this treatment option. How long will this prolong my life? Will I live longer? So if I tell them this is the PFS, that doesn't tell them that they'll live longer. Overall survival is what gives you that endpoint, right? So I think we need to also step back and look at what are patients looking for? What kind of endpoints do patients want? PFS, it's certainly a good surrogate endpoint. There's a lot of history behind PFS as that came up, actually. So I can give a whole lecture on PFS. But, if you tell a patient, this was a study that showed, you're prolonging the PFS. You're delaying the time until the tumor gets a little bigger or you develop another site, right? But you're not telling them that they'll actually live longer, they'll have a better quality of life. I think we sometimes need to reassess that, right? So these are the conversations I have with patients because, when I try to explain the data as best as in lay language, as best as I can, if they ask me that question, will I live longer? You can't answer that with PFS, right?
No, I'm just gonna say, it looks like there's two, but we have one here, so.
Right. So look at this first one. So how do you handle when prescribers are eager to use the latest drugs? It can put the pharmacist in a position where they seem like a barrier to care. So certainly, we're all looking out for the best interests of our patients. So one of the points that, I reinforce with our providers is actually the importance of a pharmacy and therapeutics committee at health centers, right? So, we often get very excited whenever a new drug comes out. And we share that excitement with the providers as well. But at the same time, it's important to step back and reassess these things. We saw examples today where maybe we see a drug that's new and exciting, but maybe that's not the best option for a health system and for the patient themselves, right? So the tasks of these Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee that many of us in this room are familiar with is really to assess not only the safety, the efficacy, the clinical trial that led to the approval, do critical appraisal there, but also understanding the financial impacts to the health system. Not every health system out there has unlimited financial flexibility, so we have to assess these things. So certainly that is one of the ways that we can consider how to handle these treatment options.
And I think to that question, it definitely can happen in real life. I think it's very realistic and that, oh, it can put farms in a position where they seem like a barrier to care. And not just with new drugs, right? Like inpatient formulary as well, when there's non-formulary requests. So I think the key to that is, I think providers and as pharmacists, who practice oncology, we love new drugs. That's actually one of the main reasons why I got into oncology is because new drugs, the amount of new approvals that are coming out. But at the same time, I think when we're having the message and how the message is delivered to your audience is very important, especially when you're talking to providers. You need to be able to establish a relationship or rapport with the provider so they understand when you're telling them, let's say we do not, let's wait to onboard this drug, it's not because of cost. I think that sometimes that tend to be one of the dots that comes up. Pharmacy is where we're kind of seeing as the gatekeeper of new or high cost drugs. That is one consideration. But when we bring drugs to P&T, the priorities are efficacy and safety. Cost is not one of the top items that's on the evaluation list. So therefore, when we're having that conversation with providers, it's certainly the cost, but the whole point of this conversation, right, is because there are a lot of new therapies that are coming out. The cost is just becoming astronomical. So whereas we have to take consideration into that. If a new therapy costs $3 million for one dose for one patient, yeah, that definitely can be significant. But at the end of the day, P&T, the goal is to look at efficacy and safety, right? So when we're having the conversation with the provider, I think it's very important how you phrase that conversation and how you're trying to work with the provider. Let's not pose it as providers making a request, we're saying no. It's okay, you're making a request, is this an appropriate request? We provide an analysis, we provide an assessment. We think it's appropriate, why? And let's work with you. If we don't think you're missing some considerations, we can of course have more meetings, have a more in-depth conversation with the provider. I think it's very important to make them feel that we're working as a team versus a barrier or a wall. So I think that's kind of at least in my experience, how you get through to the providers.
Yeah, thank you for that, Samantha. We actually do have a lot of providers on the call as well. So for those of you that hear those kind of comments, is certainly helpful. We have maybe time for one more question before we wrap up. I know you had one. Yes.
I have a question about the cost piece.
Yes.
So something that is kind of like problematic when you're analyzing the cost piece is like really that we don't know the cost. This WAC is so like nebulous because nobody really pays the WAC. So and it's a problem that we see that with the biosimilars uptake that biosimilars are priced cheaper, but in reality, from the market access and insurance perspective, they end up costing more because of all the rebates that the branded drugs have arranged with PBMs, right? So how do we even like get to understand the cost problem if we don't even know what the real prices of drugs are?
Yeah, it's certainly a good question. And I will say, you're right. So the WAC is more of a kind of a benchmark cost. And there's a lot of complexities pertaining to, the actual costs that an institution pays for patients and complexities relating to reimbursement and what kind of organization you are and what setting you're administering the medication. So what is your perspective? Do you work in a pharmacy or?
No, I'm an MD by training. I did my postdoc in cellular therapy, and I'm right in the regulatory science, the part masters. And I'm passionate about this topic, and I took like a market access and reimbursement class, and very interested in this. And, you know, I think, there may be ways of like kind of like reverse engineering, like that data that comes out from like the recent, Congress, like hearings regarding drug prices, the committees. But like, you know, I mean, it's just like that the talking about that WAC, yeah, I mean, it is shocking, but also that doesn't reflect the reality. So
To put in perspective.
I think, yeah, like, I think we need to consider like all the other, like, so maybe analyzing, you know, what are the rebates? We also need to sub-analyze by insurance type, and I think out-of-pocket cost, maybe, because it relates more to the financial burden that the patient actually has, but also like what's the burden that the insurance company has.
Exactly. I will just share that, you know, when we do these financial evaluations, we're not just looking at the WAC price. Maybe in the past we'd do something like that, but you're right. We look at all these different factors and ultimately make a decision. Chris, do you have anything to add on that?
Just 2 cents from my lens. I think when we talk about costs, we need to understand cost to whom. So there's the cost to the patient, then there's the cost to the payer. And so the PBMs that you're referring to in the middle, I'm not PBM bashing, but none of that really gets passed on to the patient, right? And so it's really the rebates get passed on to the payer. So just a consideration there. And there is no transparency in that world. And I think politically, there are many with agenda to try to create transparency in that world. So we're in the midst of that process. But with regards to WAC, I mean, I would argue that there are many products right now that are coming to market that may be exclusive or unique to the market. And there are no rebates or discounts, and we purchase at WAC because they know they can charge us that price. And so I would say with a lot of the orphan drugs, with a lot of the research that is getting drugs to the market sooner than later, for the rare disease states, good luck finding a contract. It is at WAC. So, you know, the gene therapies that are coming to the market, who's going to give you a discount? It's $3.2 million. That's WAC.
They may give you a value-based agreement.
Well, I can tell you with a lot of these CAR Ts that we are actually doing at Norris, there is no discount. It's the price is the price. And so I think the more expensive the treatments get, the more R&D that goes behind it, the more exclusive they are on the market, the less negotiating power anybody has with pharma to negotiate prices. And so what happens on the payer side, I don't know. So if they need to get on a payer formulary and there's rebates passed on, but from a health system perspective, those who are actually treating the patients, I can tell you what I'm buying them, and it's WAC. So anyway, just thought I'd share that perspective.
Definitely very insightful, hearing all the different perspectives.
I think the point you brought up about, we don't know the cost or what is the cost, right? So we at least, I think at Norris, we actually, we're part of, we provide lectures to fellows, to new fellows training in hematology or oncology. And it's mainly on pharmacology, right? But we started because of these new biotherapies that are coming out, we started including kind of price for those drugs, right? To let our providers who are still training understand from the beginning the reason why these are not on formulary, or the reasons why we have to have a more in-depth conversation when these more costly drugs are being requested, let's say on the inpatient side.
It's totally WAC.
Whack is totally whack. I like that. So, you know, if there's any other questions, you know, we can continue this conversation in the future. But, you know, thank you all for joining us today. Ran out of time, so lots of
If
productive
you have
conversation.
questions, I'm going to include Amir's contact information, and you can send him an email. But Once again, thank you to our speaker. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise today. And thank you all for joining us. And I will be sending an email with instructions on how to claim CE credit. So thanks. Thank you again.